If I were to point to one thing that makes the Trails series of Japanese RPGs so darn special, then it has to be the overarching and deeply interconnected story. Trails, as a long-running jRPG series, is unique in that it features a deeply interconnected story that's been going on for, as of now, 13 games, with more to follow in the next few years. And when I say deeply interconnected, I really mean that. There are things that were set up as far back as the very first entry in the series that are just now playing into things in the latest 13th entry. And that 13th entry, Trails Beyond the Horizon, well, it's something truly special. Beyond being both a continuation of the currently ongoing Calvard arc of the story and being a crossover of sorts with some of the previous arcs of the story, Beyond the Horizon is particularly memorable to us Trails fans because, after what seems like ages, a decade of setup and mysteries and teases, we invested players of these games are finally getting some answers. And what's pleasantly surprising is that these answers are actually both exciting and really satisfying. This isn't a Lost or Attack on Titan-like situation, where the answers to the long-running questions and mysteries are either not real answers or are ones that throw out everything that came before. No, these answers genuinely solve some long-running questions in the series lore, and the inevitable questions that come from these answers are generating a real, palpable sense of excitement for those of us that have now played and finished this latest entry. And really, while there are many things about Trails Beyond the Horizon, the 13th entry in this enigmatic JRPG series, that are worth discussing and mulling over, none are more important or pressing than what we get to learn from the ending of the game. It's not an exaggeration to say that the most important part of the Beyond the Horizon experience, as it were, is in its ending. The game's entire core focus, in terms of its storytelling, the gameplay, and all the build-up, it all leads to yet another explosive cliffhanger of an ending. Now, if you're familiar with the series, you know that the Trails games are littered with these sorts of conclusions, these exciting and intense cliffhangers that leave you genuinely stunned and have you hungering for more. I mean, we saw it with the very first game in the series, Trails in the Sky, the first chapter, and then with the ending of the second Crossbell game in Trails to Azure, not to mention that really bleak and shocking ending to the third Cold Steel game. Look, what I'm trying to say is that the shocking, cliffhangery endings that make you wonder where things are going to go from here are part and parcel of this series. But even among those sorts of endings, the top upper echelon of Trails game endings, Beyond the Horizon actually stands a bit taller and wider, because that ending and the events leading up to it finally give longtime fans those big answers like we said before. But not only that, they also give us some serious hints and some really tantalizing questions for the overall direction of the series as we seemingly head into the endgame of it all. So, today, before we cover anything else about Trails and Trails Beyond the Horizon, and as our first foray into covering this series on the channel, let's go over all the things that we now know and all the things that are left to be answered, and where developer Falcom and its awesome team of game developing maestros are going to potentially take things from here. This is going to be a full story and ending analysis video, another first for this channel. So yeah, full spoilers ahead for not only Trails Beyond the Horizon, but the entire Trails series at this point. Play through the game and the other ones, of course, and when you're done, then feel free to come back here if you haven't done that yet. Alright, without further ado, let's get into all of this. For the very first time, I might add, as we Western Trails fans are now finally standing shoulder to shoulder with our Japanese brethren, who have been, before this point, always a bit ahead in terms of game releases and familiarity with the story. Okay, so, before we get into the really juicy stuff, I think it's worth doing a really quick rundown of what exactly happens in Trails Beyond the Horizon as a whole. The excessively short version is this. The Republic of Calvard, a country and the setting for the last two games of the Trails series in Daybreak 1 and 2, announces something really big that shakes the core of the entire Zemurian continent. President Roy Gramhart announces to the world that Calvard has successfully launched its first unmanned space mission and breached the atmosphere of the planet, placing an orbital satellite into space. But that's only just the beginning, as there's an unmanned spacecraft and then a manned space mission planned to follow soon after. So yeah, we've gone from the good old days of Trails in the Sky, which had a semi-modern fantasy steampunk setting, to the industrial, tanks, and mech-based era of the Cold Steel arc, to now a full-on sci-fi level space travel story. And that space mission really is the focus of the game here, with both our Calvard band of heroes in Vaughn, Agnes, and the crew, alongside some familiar faces like Rean and some of the Thor 7 members, and of course Kevin with an unlikely band of allies, all converging in on Calvard and dealing with the various things surrounding this impending space launch. Most of Beyond the Horizon is actually set directly before the manned space launch, with the launch itself happening just as the game concludes and hits that cliffhanger ending. And while there's a lot that happens between the start of the game and that eventual space mission launch, the big things are these. Rean and his group end up traveling to the city of Basel in Calvard and unearth some truly earth-shattering information about the entire world and the continent of Zemuria. But more importantly, a certain person who's been more of a side character until now, LaToya Hamilton, gets the focus here. Kevin and his group, which features Swin, Nadia, Rufus, and Lapis, also unearth info on the same LaToya Hamilton, who Kevin is actually investigating on orders of the Septian Church. So, LaToya Hamilton, the nice old lady who was a disciple of Epstein, the scientist and inventor who's credited with the creation of the Orbments, which, as Trails fans know, is what powers most of the tech in this series, and who's also central to the Daybreak games in that he both created the Genesis that Vaughn and his group were dealing with and gathering, and was also the one who left his great-granddaughter Agnes a warning saying that the world was going to end in the year 1210, and that the Genesis were going to be the key to preventing that. Now we'll get back to Agnes in a little bit, and the Genesis and Vaughn of course, as they're kind of the main characters of this story. But, to keep things as simple as possible, it turns out that Professor Hamilton, the old lady, has been doing all kinds of crazy things in the background since the near inception of the series. Hamilton, it turns out, has not only created devices and replicas of the Genesis items we mentioned earlier, but has been using them to do all kinds of weird, reality-altering things. Whether it's obscuring the actual sky and view into space with a fake image using her replica tech in a supercomputer, or whether it's going to a certain other location and using that same tech to siphon off resources from the future to save or restore places in the present, Hamilton has been breaking all kinds of laws when it comes to nature and how things generally work. And if that weren't enough, Hamilton's replicas also result in the arrival or revival of certain people and characters from throughout the ages. People that call themselves Vestiges and who Vaughn and his group deal with throughout the course of the game. This all culminates in Calvard ultimately launching their space program, just as our various heroes and groups, the three disparate ones being Vaughn, Rean, and Kevin, all learned the actual secrets behind the mission itself, to confront and destroy the Septian of Time, a being that's actually been hiding outside the atmosphere in space and has been controlling the lives of everyone in the Zemurian continent. It's here that we get the first of the big twists at the end. The mission to defeat the Septian of Time actually fails, with Calvard's combination of their best mecha battle machine and a bunch of nuclear missiles all being unable to topple this being that has the power to control time, and that world-ending event that Epstein warned his granddaughter about, that just gets accelerated. And then comes the big lore reveal. It turns out that the Septian of Time ends up resetting time for the entire Zemurian continent whenever a certain value of what it calls sin is reached. And so, instead of this happening in the year 1210 as Epstein warned, or in August of 1209 as the government of Calvard believed, the reset sequence ends up starting up at that very moment. And it's here that Agnes, the female lead of this story, and the whole Calvard arc at this point, springs into action and ultimately uses the agenesis that she and Vaughn and her group gathered in the last two games to transform herself into some new kind of being and be able to hack into the Septian of Time just enough to prevent the reset from going too far back. The original reset, having intended to go all the way back to the year 0, actually ends up only going back some unknown amount of time thanks to Agnes's efforts, and, as is hinted at and said by multiple characters in the ending, there's some huge price to pay for Agnes doing all of this. Thus comes that gigantic cliffhanger. As Agnes stops things from being completely reset, we see key scenes of the last two games fade out of existence, as Vaughn, the other main character of the story, runs towards Agnes in vain, just before he too fades away and the entire reset completes. And at the end of it all, we're at a really interesting place. Agnes has potentially sacrificed herself in some way, and despite her friends and even her father's best efforts, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Graham Hart is her father, the president of Calvard. She ends up saving everyone to some degree, although we're not sure where things will be when we come back in the next game, and just what is going to be reset and what will remain. Which of course brings us to those answers and mysteries that I mentioned earlier. See, going as far back as the first game in the series, Trails in the Sky, there have been some ongoing mysteries and wonders about the world that the Trails series is set in. Rather than being set in an entire world, somewhat different from our own and powered by magic via orbments and Septian and all that, the world of Trails as we've known it has really just been limited to one continent, the continent of Zemuria. And the games throughout the series have really called attention to that fact. Why is everyone in Zemuria just in Zemuria? Why can't people leave the continent and see the rest of the world? Why are there so many weird things happening here? And how exactly is the technological advancement and progress happening at such a rapid pace here? We go from the steam engine in the first game to space travel and the internet in the 13th, which all actually happens in the span of just 60 in-game years. So, clearly, something is off about Zemuria, and it's in Beyond the Horizon that we finally learn two key things. 1. There's a barrier around the continent of Zemuria, one that extends all the way up from space and goes all the way down to the planet's surface. Most people just didn't know about that due to LaToya Hamilton obscuring things for some unknown reason. And number 2, the reason for this extremely contracted development and advancement of society has to do with an even darker and more twisted secret. The residents of Zemuria are stuck in a time loop. And not only is there a time loop, but it's a time loop that has been reset almost 20,000 times. The latest loop, the 20,000th one, being the one that we've been playing throughout the Trails series. And these two things are big answers because they hint at why things are the way that they are in this world for one. It's something that's been hinted at throughout the series, with characters from the terrorist organization known as Oroboros, and even the dominant religious organization of the continent, the Septian Church, both moving around and obscuring these particular facts while seeming to know them. But besides learning that humanity is stuck in a perpetual time loop, where the Septian of Time decides based on some unknown criteria that it's time to reset everything, are the mechanics around this particular reset system. See, the reset, however it happens, isn't exactly perfect. There are things that slip through the cracks. Certain people will remember things from other timelines or loops, whether it's LaToya Hamilton herself, who mentions near the end about this timeline having been doomed from the start due to the statue outside of Krell Village, or whether it's the whole thing with Novartis. Novartis, who's been the brains behind the antagonist group known as Oroboros, reveals near the end that there was a timeline or a cycle where he was the sole disciple of Epstein, something that contradicts this current cycle where Epstein has 3 major disciples in Hamilton, Russell from Liberal, and Schmidt from Arabonia. But it's not just the memories or the recollection of events either, as we find out through Vaughn's part of the story that one of his team members in Reset is actually someone from the future of a different timeline. Reset ends up being discovered by the Marduk Corporation in a life support tank that has the year 1258 etched on it, indicating that she's from a timeline where Zemuria made it 40 years past the potential reset point of this timeline. So, Beyond the Horizon tells us that there's a time loop, but then that there are ways for both people and information to carry over from reset to reset. And then, of course, we also know that Epstein and the family line of his adopted daughter can actually hack into the Septian of Time and prevent the reset to some degree somehow. Now, it's worth noting that while we do know all of this stuff now, what we don't know has also expanded by just a little bit. Like any good mystery, the answers here lead to a lot more interesting questions. Why is Zemuria the way it is? Why is the so-called goddess Adios, who created the Septarians and left them here, doing all of this? Does she even exist, or is she just a myth? How do certain people know all of this stuff, and how are they working through or around this? Oroboros, for instance, which was more of an antagonistic force in the first 2 story arcs of the series, and has now sort of become a more neutral wildcard third party, has this whole plan that their Grandmaster is enacting. We know from the Liberal, Crossbell, and Arabonia arcs that Oroboros has been gathering or replicating the power of the Septarians that they've been able to find. Liberal's Space Septarian, Crossbell's Mirage One, and the Earth and Fire Septarians of Arabonia. Yet, for the next phase of their plan, this reset that happens for the 20,000th time is actually the first step for the next phase of their plan. There's an implication that the Grandmaster, who we see properly for the first time in this game, is someone who is unaffected by these resets somehow. But that leads to more questions, such as why was Oroboros and their counterpoint in the Septian Church both content to let things play out as they did? And added to that, there's the surprising amount of similarities between Nina, the saint of the end for the church, and the Grandmaster, in terms of both appearance and, as one character mentions, in terms of power as well. And speaking of the church and its saint of the end, Nina, who's been more of a side character in the story until this point, we find out via one of the memory fragments in the game's optional Grimgarten dungeon that Nina, when she first came to this world, was speaking a foreign language that no one save for the head of the Septian Church, or Tesia, could understand. The language is actually one that cannot be understood or even heard by anyone in Zemuria. It's something that fans of the series are all too familiar with. Vaughn's Hollow, Mare, who unlocks his Grendel form, also has a true name that more or less has the same restrictions on it. And that is seemingly still one of the larger mysteries that we still need answers to. Why are there certain words or languages that are almost forbidden and locked out by some kind of system that prevents the residents of Zemuria from even hearing or in some ways understanding them at all? That, I think, is something that we're bound to see as we finally get to understand the last pieces of Vaughn and his relationship to both Agnes, the Genesis, and the Zemurian continent at large. We already know, of course, that Vaughn is the vessel and the shackles for the Lord of Demons, but as Mare and the Daybreak games have hinted at, there's more to him than just that, and he has a larger role to play in terms of the world. What's interesting is that, of course, in this game and in this latest timeline, Vaughn is relegated to more of a side character than a direct player in the events that happen. He doesn't actively confront the Septarian of Time, nor does he do anything to prevent the reset. He more or less is relegated to flailing around and piecing together what's going on. But hey, if there's one thing that's made abundantly clear, it's that despite the inclusion of both Rean and Kevin in this game, this is and very much will continue to be Vaughn's story. The cliffhanger ending of the game concludes with a "to be continued in Vaughn's final chapter" message. So it's clear that whatever the deal is with the Septarian of Time and the Genesis, it's Vaughn that's going to ultimately be the key to resolving it. Now, this is more speculation than anything definitive, but my guess here is that the next game is going to have us rejoin Vaughn and start us off right before the events of the previous two Daybreak games. And the reason I think so are that the scenes with Agnes meeting Vaughn for the first time fade away in the ending, which either hint at her existence being erased entirely, or, more likely, time resetting back to before any of that happened. Now, what will be interesting to see is if we get an alternate timeline where Agnes never existed, or if we get one where the fateful meeting between Agnes and Vaughn never happens. Both things will result in things being very different, as it's Vaughn's meeting with Agnes that ultimately results in his entire crew coming together, whether it's the search for the Genesis that basically gets us to this point, or their bonds between one another. There's also the additional question of Agnes herself. Well, yeah, we already are wondering about the cost Agnes paid. There is credence to the fact that Agnes's existence itself may have been erased in some way, or that there may be a new Agnes post-reset different from our current one. See, there's this side quest in the game that has Vaughn and crew tracking down the author of a particular book. a book that's been featured in the Trail series as far back as the Crossbell arc. The book in question, Sunshine Agnes, turns out to have been sent to a newspaper agency in the town of Anchorville in Calvard by an anonymous person. But what makes things even more interesting is the note and the locket that is sent with the book. The note mentions something about the Other Agnes. We also get a scene with a Vestige removing her mask and having blonde hair similar to Agnes at the end of the game too. So, this whole mystery of the Other Agnes and how that whole concept relates to whatever price Agnes pays to prevent the reset is definitely something to take note of and keep an eye out for. And it's also likely something that we'll learn about pretty quickly in the next game. And since we're on the topic of Vestiges now, that's the next major thing that's quite intriguing. We know from the game that the Vestiges are kind of like glitches or bugs that have resulted from fluctuations in time due to the whole reset thing happening. But there's still so much to learn. Can anyone become a Vestige? What are the rules or criteria that determine whether someone can become a Vestige and likely appear outside of their normal time? Do you have to be dead to do so? Do the Vestiges simply disappear whenever time resets? My guess here is that the Vestiges are almost like a sign that the end of time or the reset of time is coming. They're like the harbingers of change, and Professor Hamilton does mention that ultimately the Vestiges will continue to exist if Roy Graham Hart and Calvard's plan to kill the Septian of Time actually succeeds. So, it's more than likely that we won't be seeing the Vestiges in the next game until we get to the point in the story where another grand reset is imminent. That said, there is the other question about what exactly Rune Kincaid and his Grendel Shaddai form is. Yeah, it's clear that he's powered by the replicas, but the level of power and control over time almost make him seem like something more. That leads me to another particular theory. Could the Grendels in both Vaughn and Kincaid actually be the guardians of the Septian of Time? As we know from the other games, each Septian has its own guardian, and we haven't seen one for the Septian of Time yet. Also worth noting, of course, is that the color for the Time Sepith in the game is shown to be a purple-black color, which does seem eerily close to the color of Vaughn's Grendel form, which has shades of purple-black and blue. But maybe I'm reading a bit too much into it. Or am I? If there's one thing that's true about Trails, it's that the details like this can actually matter. And if interviews with head honcho and the CEO of Falcom, Toshihiro Kondo, say anything, it's that Falcom is keeping those details just as much in mind as we are. Kondo, in an interview with Dengeki Online, actually mentioned something really interesting about the whole Time Septian and the whole time loop thing. In the game, while there's this whole concept of the sin value that increments up and then leads to a time reset, the counter itself can actually also go down. Kondo highlights this particular point in the interview, noting, and as is also noted in the game, that when the Septian of Steel tried to subjugate humanity in the Cold Steel arc, the sin counter actually went down in that case, delaying the time reset. And, as we know from the whole origin story of Reset that we learn in this game, there was a timeline where the world made it to the year 1259. But, as we see in another one of those Grimgarten memory fragments, and in the last section of Anchorville in the game, that era where time has gone past 1210 is an era where the world is crumbling and likely ravaged by destruction. Again, this is me guessing at this point, but it's likely a timeline where tensions between Calvard and Erebonia never really cooled down, and the war that was averted in Reverie and Cold Steel 4 ultimately played out and laid waste to a good chunk of the populace of Zemuria. The hint here, then, is that humanity kind of has to stay at a particular level of development and technological advancement. Otherwise, the reset triggers. But, if anything, what that technological advancement is, or whether it's some sort of state that the society has to hit, is still an unknown. But hey, since Falcom's CEO himself is highlighting it, I imagine we'll know by the end of the next game what the sin value really is, and the rules behind the reset, for sure. And speaking of the next game, in the same interview, Kondo mentioned that both Rean and Kevin are still going to be major players in the next game's story. Rean, in particular, is interesting in that his entire goal in the story of Beyond the Horizon, beyond what he and his friends discover about LaToya Hamilton, is to meet up with his swordmaster, the sword hermit Yun Kunfai. And when we do ultimately see the meeting with Kunfai and Rean, the notions here are very interesting. It very much seems like Kunfai is prepping Rean to be a sort of weapon, one that reaches a level beyond anything else. Is Rean, with both his awakening eye and the other self experiences that he had in Reverie, someone who can actually become strong enough to fight against a Septian, the Septian of time perhaps? See, the whole idea of Project Levitain is the idea that a mystical sword has the power to slay the seemingly powerful Septians. Calvard and its president Graham Hart, who create this whole project, try to fashion this blade through human wisdom and technology. But is it actually Rean who's the one who's supposed to achieve a level of power where he is that blade? Kunfai, after all, mentions that Rean has to grow beyond his current level, and then find his blade. It's an interesting idea for sure, and it's very curious, because despite this primarily being Vaughn's story arc, it seems like Rean is likely either going to play a major role, an almost secondary protagonist role in the final chapter of this arc, or there's also the chance that Rean is being set up as a major player for the series' final arc, the one that's going to follow after the Calvard arc. See, Kondo once again, in that same Dengeki interview, mentions that after the Calvard arc is done in the next game, that the Trail series will hit that 90% level of completion in terms of story. So, essentially, the remaining 10% is going to be told in the next series of games, whether it's a trilogy or another set of 5 games. The Church, Oroboros, and the larger questions beyond what's related to the Septian of Time and Vaughn are likely going to be handled there. And yeah, it definitely feels like we're getting pretty darn close to those ultimate answers and to seeing that big clash and conclusion for this insanely epic, larger-than-life fantasy story. If Beyond the Horizon is any indication, then well, Falcom certainly seems like they're going to deliver. I mean, despite my issues with Beyond the Horizon itself, which I'll cover in another video, the story beats and reveals here are immensely satisfying, well set up, and undoubtedly exciting. And it really seems like Falcom is taking this conclusion and the finish to both the Calvard arc and the overall Trail story pretty seriously. Which of course makes 2026 such an awesome year to be a Trails fan. We in the West have not only caught up with Japan after years and years of being behind, but the future is looking exciting and bright for the Trails franchise as a whole. There's the second Trails in the Sky remake coming out later this year, globally, and then there's going to be the wait and anticipation for the potential final Calvard arc game. To all of that, I guess I have one final question here, and that's about you, the person who made it to the end of this video. What did you think about all of this? Did the answers and questions that came from Beyond the Horizon excite you as much as they did me? What are your theories and hopes for the next game? Please, feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts, and please like and subscribe if you found this little speculation ramble frenzy thing about the Trails series to be a good or fun time. I definitely intend to cover more of the Trails series moving forward, as to me, this is definitely the biggest and most important Japanese role-playing game series of our time. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll hopefully see you in the comment section below, or at the very least, in the next video.